Hey, what's up, guys? So, a couple weeks ago, I finished reading this book by Kimberly Brubaker Bradley. It's really short. It's only like, let's see, 181 pages, so it's like real short. I read it just because I was having a busy time at school, and also I've read this before. The author who wrote this, has written other history-related books. Is kind of it's her niche. She writes like little history books for kids. I actually got this because our teacher had read it to me in the 3rd grade, which makes me 9, which is going to be relevant later in the video. I was 9 when we first read this. So this book is about a French spy by the name of Suzanne during World War II. She goes to a private school, and she's also very musical. Her career goal is to be an opera singer. And it's primarily about like the war, how it affects her family, how it affects the community around her, and so on. This book is intended for people who are young. It's, I believe, on Amazon, it said it was rated for 12 and up. However, the very first chapter is like weirdly graphic. It's super out of place, and the rest of the book is just so tame. It's weird, to be honest. It's really weird. I'll talk about it more. I know some people might consider the first chapter, especially in such a short book, a spoiler. But I can't really talk about how I felt about it without discussing that. Essentially, what I got from this book is that when I first read it, I was too young to read it. Now I'm too old to properly enjoy it. A lot of the characters, I feel like, are kind of unrealistic. So, like, for example, they're not super empathetic towards each other. They're all going through the same thing. Her father is really unempathetic towards her situation. One of her friends, and this happens at the beginning, spoiler alert if you consider it a spoiler, one of her friends is involved in a harbor bombing, and she becomes a mute, and the main character, Suzanne, even though it's her best friend, like, she's not really super empathetic towards her situation either. Halfway through, she starts to find visiting her tedious and annoying, and just, she's a really whiny protagonist who just doesn't care about other people. Like, it says that she's motivated to become a spy because of her experience and how she's seen other people suffer during the war. But she's so unempathetic that it's really hard to believe that it's not just some, like, I'd almost think it would be more of a hero complex for her with her attitude. Because in her other career, which is music, it's all about, acknowledgement, or at least she reads that way. She wants to be successful and she loves singing, but she also wants praise for it. And it's hard to, based on her attitude just through the whole book, it's hard to imagine that being a French spy isn't much the same way. You don't really get involved very much with other people outside of her family. So I'm going to get into the spoiler part of the review now. So essentially, the first chapter opens up with them at school, and they beg and plead. I think there's nuns there, so I assume it's a Catholic school. I don't know. I'm not super well versed in religion, but they beg to go to the beach to study as long as they'll do their homework. They can have a little time off. So they beg to go to the beach on the day that the harbor is bombed. And of course they don't know that it's going to be bombed. They get there, they're like, this is a little weird. There's nobody here. It's very empty. There's not a war going on or anything. And so they just continue to hang around. And there's this pregnant lady who I guess is one of their neighbors. And she comes up and she's talking to him. She has her son with her. And, you know, boom, the bombs drop. The first impression of this book would be, in my opinion, that it was written for adults. Because it has a very, very graphic scene and depiction of this pregnant woman who has been completely beheaded, like her head's gone, no one knows where her head is, and additionally, lying beside her is, you know, the fetus of her unborn baby. And I'm like, my class read this when I was 9. Did they skip that part? I don't remember that part. And the reason I don't remember it is because the rest of the book is so vanilla. Like, you know, they don't, the people in this book don't really suffer. They're not, it would have been more interesting if it had been about someone else, like someone who more actively, she doesn't become a spy until, let me see. She doesn't become a spy until page 105. Out of this 181 page book. She's a spy for less than half the book. She's a spy for less than 81 pages. And it's not even that interesting to read about her spy antics because A, there's not very many of them. B, they don't go in very much detail of them. It's kind of just in passing, like, oh, I had to carry like 20 notes today to other members of the resistance. Wow, what a great time. But it doesn't tell us anything about it. And, you know, it's boring. Like, first off, she's a weird protagonist because she has no reaction whatsoever to anything. Like, her whole thing is supposed to be that she's, you know, tough. But she's tough in a really unrealistic way. She's tough in the way that, like, a sociopath would be tough. Like, you know, they don't get, you know, super emotional. They don't have a huge reaction to other people suffering. Like, in the beginning, when she's at the harbor that's being bombed, like, there's no really response afterwards. First off, she got off pretty scot-free. Like, she got a little cut up, but compared to the beheaded pregnant lady, not a lot of adverse effects. But the first thing that she really sees after that is this, like, woman that supposedly she knows who's been beheaded and who has a fetus laying beside her. She's like, I guess I better cover that with my jacket. And, you know, her friend's completely freaking out. She, instead of, like, finding an ambulance or someone to help or something, what makes her friend walk all the way back to the school. Like, clearly her friend is, like, emotionally distraught and doesn't get any help for quite a while because she's like, oh, well, let's go home. Because that's realistic. And then she's like, well, I'm sure the nuns would understand if I missed school, but basically I'm just not like that. Like, yeah, you were just bombed yesterday. Like, yeah, we're gonna really focus on our physics. But so, following that, it's just her, like, observing. I mean, the only really bad thing that really happens to her family is they get kicked out of their house. Which, I get it, I empathize. Like, it's hard to find resources and they get kicked out of their house. That's the only thing that really happens to them. She's just there to observe terrible, well, she doesn't even really get to observe anything. She's just there to know about terrible things that happen to other people. So, like, for example, there's this taxi driver who I believe his deal was he was an African American. She was like, I'm sure he's fine. Hitler only hates Jews. It's fine. And she notices that, and she doesn't even know this dude, but she notices that his taxi hasn't moved in a few days, and eventually gets hauled off, and she hasn't seen him. She hasn't seen, like, it. She sees in his house, it looks like maybe they went in and took his whole family out. Like, it's lived in, but it's, like, torn up. You know, she's not reacting. She's not reacting to anything. She's like, oh, that happened. Like, everything's just like, well, this happened. It's like, show us, don't tell us. She's just telling us everything that has happened in this whole story. And it's really dull. Because I don't get to get nothing happens that's bad to anyone that I'm particularly attached to, except for the doctor. So her friend, we see her for 10 pages. Oh God, she's been blown up. She's a mute. Her mom's fine. Her dad's fine. Both of her brothers are fine. They all make it out okay. She gets captured for like maybe 24 hours before she gets rescued. The only person who anything happens to them is the doctor. And he basically, towards halfway through the book, she falls while she's holding a knife and, like, slices her shoulder open. And she has to go get the injury drained. And so, which, by the way, nothing is just said on the side. It's just on the side. Like, they don't go into any detail about it, which is part of what makes the first chapter so out of place. But so she goes, she has it drained. The doctor's like, you're really tough. You should maybe, potentially, possibly, let's be a French spy. I feel like you'd be good at it. You're very young. No one would think anything of it. And so, she does. Obviously, there wouldn't be a book. And, all he's doing is trying to help the resistance, which obviously makes him the biggest target. But, he and his whole family, including his, like, very, very young son, get murdered. And that's the only person that anything happens to that, like, and you're in any way attached to. Everyone else ends up fine. It's, like, I get it. It's for kids, but that wasn't the reality. It would have been more effective if it's trying to be effective literature. She's never in any danger. There's not, and maybe it's because I've already read it before, but there's no maybe she won't make it out. There's no like it's like you get to the last like 20 pages and it's like, well, nothing bad has happened so far. So why should it now? I don't know. It was just kind of a dull read. I didn't hate it. Like, the longer I went not doing this review, the more I thought about it, the less I liked it. So, like, when I first read it, I was like, yeah, it's okay. It's not bad. But, like, there are so many things that happen in it that are just so out of place. It could have been better done. If you have, like, a younger kid that is really, really interested in World War II, just be aware of the first paragraph, but this is basically World War II for babies. And, that's about what I expected it to be. I mean, like, it's not horrible. It's just, 10 it up. It's just, I remember reading, I think it was called The Star of David, for the same age group. And I remember that being really good. And I remember when I was like 11 or 12 reading, we looked at the Diary of Anne Frank. And, it's the Diary of Anne Frank. Like, it's probably the most well-known piece of Jewish literature during World War II. And, they, obviously, the Diary of Anne Frank is real, so it was way more effective, but they were both way more effective, and I wanted this to be up there with them. It's just so fake. I mean, that's the main thing about it, is I feel like I'm not reading somebody's story. I'm reading a fictional piece of literature, which is what it is, but the literature shouldn't feel like a fictional piece of literature where no one has any reactions or any real responses, like, and the people aren't like people. But so I guess that's my review of it. That's where I landed on it. I probably won't reread it. I think that's how I really judge a book, is if I'll reread it. I remembered it being good when I was a little kid, and I didn't have any way to judge quality as much. But as an adult, like, I kind of judge things based on whether or not I'd reread it. And I think that I could just buy a different book on the same topic that would be considerably better. So maybe skip this one, unfortunately.